Welcome to this webinar of the Royal Anthropological Institute, which is part of our Anthropological Responses to COVID-19 series. This is a little bit of housekeeping at the start, so you can orient yourself with how things are going to be. We have two RAI staff here with us today. That's myself, Annelieke, and my lovely colleague, Emma.
Hello, everybody. I will be in the chat box if you want to say hello.
Yes. So Emma will be monitoring the chat box for any technical issues and other questions you have today, so you can type them in there. The other button you have to use today is for the Q&A. So make sure the questions for the subject of the presentations go in the Q&A. Other questions go into the chat box. You will find these controls at the bottom, usually, if you're coming in on a laptop or a phone. If you're coming in on a tablet, they might be in the upper right-hand corner, and if they're invisible, they will become apparent when you hover over them or click somewhere on your screen, in case you don't see them right this moment. Let me see. Make sure that if you write something in the messages in the text chat, that you write to all panelists and attendees so everybody can read it. The panelists themselves will not answer any questions or respond to anything in that chat box today. Then in the Q&A section, we want you to put those questions in the Q&A box. And the beauty of that is you can upvote questions. So every time you see a question that you like or a similar question that was on your mind, please upvote it so we can respond to those interesting questions first. You can also send us questions anonymously by checking that little hook next to the Submit Question button. So that's about the questions. The order of our event today is so that our first three speakers, Dr. Erika Borgstrom, Dr. Simon Cohn, and Dr. Annelieke Driessen will speak for 30 minutes, and then that will be followed by 15 minutes Q&A. After that, we will listen to Dr. Arnar Árnason and his presentation again for 30 minutes, followed by 15 minutes Q&A. And at the end, we'll have everybody on stage for 20-minute Q&A of a general kind. If you have a specific question, especially later in the general Q&A to a specific speaker, make sure you write the name in front of that so we know who to address the question to. We will probably not be able to answer all your questions. There's usually too many. Please know that this event will be recorded. So if you want to remain entirely anonymous, send in your question anonymously, because we often read out the name of the question asker when we pose it. Otherwise, if you have any follow-up questions in the end that are still burning and you need to get them out, you can write them to my email, which is info@therai.org.uk, and I can pass them on to the speakers as well. All right, that's it from me. I'm going to hand over to David now, our chair.
Well, thank you, Annelieke. Thank you, Emma. And welcome everybody to the last of the present sequence of COVID-19 seminars that we've all enjoyed doing enormously. We do not hold events in August at the RAI, and that includes virtual events as well. So we look forward to welcoming you back in September. I suppose I should say my normal thing, which is that the RAI really only exists because of the kindness of the people out there who are prepared to become fellows of our institute. We really do need all the support that we can get. So if you would like to become a fellow at the institute, please just do a glance at the website, and as you see, Emma has put up the link in the chat, and we'd like very much to welcome you. Well, we are delighted to continue with the present series of COVID-19 seminars that have been all equally stimulating, and we've had a great accumulation of ideas as we move from one to the next. And today is no exception. We've got two linked papers. So all we really need to do is to welcome Dr. Borgstrom from the Open University, Dr. Cohn from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and Dr. Driessen from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine as well. And they will be speaking for about half an hour, at which point we will move to the first set of questions and answers.
Hi, everyone. I'm Simon. So this is very much a joint paper, and we're in 3 very different physical locations. So we're not quite sure how we'll coordinate this. Luckily, Annelieke has agreed to show the slides. So I'm hoping that those are available. And just a quick word to say, and then perhaps Erica and Annelieke can follow me, just to say that this is based on a funded project that we were doing on end-of-life care a long time before the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, we initiated this or started thinking about this, I think, about 4 years ago. And it's very much towards the end of our fieldwork that the pandemic has occurred, and we rapidly tried to collect some of the fieldwork data that we have today through the contacts we had already established during that project. Erica and Annelieke, do you want to quickly say hello, and then we can move into the paper?
Yeah. So hi, I'm Erica Borgstrom. I'm from the Open University, and as Simon said, this is a project we've been doing for quite a while. And also it's important to note that some of us have been researching palliative and end-of-life care for actually quite a long period of time. So we're using that knowledge to help understand how things have changed in light of COVID-19 as well.
Okay, so I'll start with the project and then some general ideas and themes, and then we'll move into some of the specific material that we want to draw on to provide a kind of ethnographic set of ethnographic kind of insights onto a line of argument. We have the first slide, Annelieke. So there's little doubt that the pandemic has made death more present in the public imagination. It has inescapably foregrounded questions relating to, of course, the care of the dying, the fact that often difficult choices have to be made, and that end of life invariably concerns the carers and the relatives as well as those who actually die. In so doing, it's made us all not only think about mortality in an existential way, but also acknowledge the ways in which death and dying are an intrinsic part of social life. Now, this is not simply because we all probably now know someone who may well have died of the disease, but because a dominant way by which the pandemic became a reality was through all these different macro representations of the collective, making clear that disease was not only something that threatened us individually, but was a manifest danger for society as a whole. So in this talk, we want to describe how matters relating to end-of-life care during the initial COVID-19 peak serve to highlight a fundamental tension, as we see it, between these official representations of society, which underscored government and public health policy, and the kind of social life that we witnessed being enacted by healthcare professionals, who were struggling to care for patients and often care for the relatives as well. It's often said that society is more than the sum of its parts, in an attempt to reconcile the fact that there are actually two incommensurable ways to think about the collective that are being invoked at the same time. We argue, however, that as soon as one talks about the sum of the parts, one is already on course to adopt a logic of the aggregate that actually negates other ways of conceptualizing the social and cultural world, and that struggles to accommodate the idea that forms of relating, such as the ones through care, which we will talk about, actually constitute what society means. Now, instead of seeing this tension as one that arises from, say, different academic concepts or definitions, we instead want to draw on ethnographic insights from the UK to describe how these conceptualizations emerged in practice and how they shaped the way those at the end of life were actually treated. Next slide, Annelieke. A great deal of official reporting, certainly in the UK, unsurprisingly drew on a legal political discourse that emphasized how we're citizens facing a common threat and that we needed to act responsibly and in solidarity as members of a democratically governed population. Through the constant bombardment of daily death rates, international comparisons, discussion of subpopulations, and the classification of vulnerable groupings, the vision of COVID-19 was constructed alongside a particular understanding of the collective that was defined through these metrics. Daily reports by SAGE, which was the UK advisory body, reported totals, ratios, and numerical comparisons, and they became a way to cement a kind of epidemiological basis of public health to the political notion of population. Put simply, COVID-19 rapidly became tied inextricably to an idea of population and its tallies of mortality. Now, a related feature of this was that, unsurprisingly, the compilations of data followed official sites and locations where those figures actually were knowable, namely initially hospitals and then later other kinds of institutions, leaving other non-spaces silent. These general places of data production not only provided the key account of the population that was under threat, but they provided growing evidence of the development of a range of intervention policies that consistently emphasized notions of social distance. Can we have the next slide? Now, in that reporting, a common strategy that rapidly became adopted by the UK Prime Minister, by government spokespersons, and in fact many other media outlets such as this BBC website, was to follow up the showing of graphs and tables with the message that every death is the death of a loved one, the loss of a family member, a tragedy for those that knew them, and so on. Now, this clearly was an attempt to make these kind of numbers meaningful, to establish a way for people to be able to relate to the figures by shifting from the scale of the population to that of the individual. Except, we'd argue, numbers are by definition abstract units, stripped of their individuality and their place in the world. So these kind of postscripts could only ever be partially successful because relating is the basis of a very different rendition of the collective to start with, one that begins with formative interactions of persons and not the division and subdivision of a population of bodies. One key form of such processes was of process of relating, and one that we want to concentrate on, were of course the notions of care. And one dimension of that care was intimacy. So we want to argue that during the initial months of the pandemic, because care is such an intrinsically relational activity, it was regularly pushed out into the margins as more dominant configurations of the national collective, the population, and national service were invoked. This then left those that care for the ill and care for the dying of having to navigate their own way. So we instead focus on how the health professionals, or some of them at least, had the task of caring for those at the end of life during the height of the first spike, had to find ways to intimately relate, even when the resources were stretched and the policies that were produced by government and public health became increasingly obstructive. I want to shift now to Erica to present a section.
All right. Now, before we start sharing some of the data that we've collected since COVID-19 started, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about our existing study, The Forms of Care. So that's been going on for several years, as Simon mentioned, and if you are able to, you can use that QR code to go to our website, and there's a link at the end of the slides as well. The Forms of Care study set out to try to understand what we call non-interventions in palliative care. So often palliative care is introduced as a specialty that comes in when a patient's told nothing more can be done. And we wanted to understand what is that nothing and what does care look like in these times. The study has given us a sense of knowledge of what palliative and end-of-life care can do and what they're often doing, and a lot of connections within London, which we've then used to help understand what's changed since COVID-19. This slide shows some of the methods we've been using within the palliative Forms of Care study with the palliative care teams. It's an ethnographic study where we've been regularly engaging with two related specialist palliative care teams. One's based in a large London teaching hospital, and it's their sister or related community team that covers parts of London. We've been visiting their team meetings that involve doctors, nurses, social workers, physiotherapists, occupational therapists. We've been shadowing the individual staff members in their day-to-day work when we were able to do that, and also talking to them about what it is they do, how they make sense of what they do. And Annelieke has also then followed up with individual patients and their family members over several periods of time to see how care develops over time. And this helped us figure out what was going on. And as we developed our initial thoughts around our study, we held collaboratory workshops with the care professionals that we were working with to play around with some of the ideas and further develop our analyses. Now, at this point, I want to point out that palliative care in the UK is generally understood to be the holistic, individualized care of someone who's been diagnosed with a life-limiting or incurable disease, and isn't necessarily just about end-of-life care. But often the cases that we were hearing in these team meetings or that we were shadowing involved death and dying in some form. And actually, during the COVID-19 interviews and email exchanges and workshops that we had, there was a lot more emphasis on death and dying, as Simon pointed out. So there was this collapsing then of palliative and end-of-life care, both in our prior study and during our recent research. Can I have the next slide now, please, Annelieke? So we've been talking to our collaborators since March, and that's been through emails, interviews, workshops. And not only have we been able to speak to palliative care professionals, but we've also spoken to some of their related colleagues in ICUs and GPs. And there were several key themes that emerged from these conversations in trying to understand how palliative care was responding to COVID-19 as it was unfolding. Now, many of you will be aware, and possibly also experienced yourself, there was this sort of constant and rapid changing sense of what COVID-19 might be or bring, and the multiple predictions about how people would suffer from the disease and how many people might end up dying. Now, although the word unprecedented was often overused in the UK media, there was a sense from some of our collaborators that they felt a great sense of uncertainty and lack of central guidance about what to do in the face of this pandemic. That resulted in many individual team members and even people having to devise their own ways on how to respond and make sense of what to do. There was also a sense that these rapid changes were stretching an already fragmented NHS system, which prevented a standardized approach on how to provide care and made the individual professionals feel quite exposed and vulnerable. Now, this vulnerability was compounded by the very material sense of vulnerability that they often felt when they were dealing with COVID-infected patients. Next slide, please, Annelieke. So I'm going to first focus on this heightened sense of uncertainty and vulnerability that they were experiencing and talking to us, and that came through really in the early conversations we were having. Across the NHS, some of the very earliest responses that the palliative care teams were doing was a sort of concern and prediction about just how they might provide the care that they felt was clearly going to be necessary. They knew there was going to be an increased demand for palliative and end-of-life care because of how the disease was initially presenting, but they weren't quite sure at that point what kind of care would need to be given and what the best kind of care would be, because the disease was at that time deemed quite unpredictable. Although there was that uncertainty, there was also a sense of excitement by some of the team members we spoke with, because they had a feeling that the palliative care teams had a really good track record of dealing to such challenges and responding to them quickly, and also for being recognized as experts in managing uncertainty in difficult conversations. So they were sort of quite well poised to operate in the system. Nevertheless, certain individuals were quite aware that the pandemic was going to come with added ethical dilemmas in how to treat people. The professionals we spoke to had some reservations about potential repercussions for the decisions that they were having to make. And even now, actually, some of them are reflecting with hindsight on some of those decisions. And that's particularly around things about like when not to intervene, how to escalate treatment, and the problems of having to make decisions when not having the full information and having to make them really rapidly without knowing what someone may want themselves. As one hospital palliative care consultant phrased it about his experience, he said, ethics has moved away from our usual approach of autonomy towards utilitarian. And he then reflected on how that made him feel very uncomfortable, especially given the lack of national guidance. And it actually prompted him to be part of a pan-London working group to develop some decision-making guidance for professionals. Within the community teams that we spoke with, it was noted that actually death was becoming far more prominent within the community than it previously perhaps was, but also that they were suddenly faced with decisions around to admit someone or not to admit someone to hospital, knowing that that decision could mean that it might be the last time someone's able to see their family. So both in the community and the hospital settings, the professionals we spoke to were reflecting on the difficulty and urgency of having to decide who needs certain levels of treatment and where that treatment should be, and the social and ethical repercussions of those decisions. And that level of ethical dilemmas is not necessarily always articulated to their work in the same extent on day-to-day practice. There was an added level to this, though, in that they felt a very palpable fear, and as one consultant actually labeled it, mortal fear, that dealing with COVID patients could risk their own health or the health and lives of those they cared for or loved. This added to their feelings of uncertainty and anxiety and actually complicated that sense of ethical decision-making. One GP wrote us in an email when reflecting on end-of-life care that in the primary care context, I have been challenged to consider what we mean by first do no harm in this context, and also always make your patient your first concern. she wrote, "These fundamental ethical positions are becoming very, very complex in this scenario, as we increasingly realize that keeping the team safe has to be very high if we are to serve the overall good. So they're having to weigh up different senses of individuals and collectives and having to weigh them up against each other." When we held our workshop with the palliative care teams last month, some of them actually commented on how the decisive leadership within the teams, particularly around issues around physical or social distancing, helped manage individual anxiety and perhaps helped keep the overall team's health up. And they were making comparisons with the palliative care team with other parts of the healthcare system that perhaps did not make those decisions as quickly. Annelieke, next slide. Now, these initial conversations that really emphasized uncertainty and the ethical dilemmas that they were telling us about, it gave an overall impression that the usual ways of working and the usual ways that the staff approached their work was having to change, and particularly in the context of end-of-life care. So firstly, the staff we spoke to really commented on how their working routines had to change because of the disease and the decisions that were being made around it. They were unable to be with the patients as they usually intended to because of things like social and physical distancing, the PPE requirements, but also they had quite a change in their patient caseload. The type of people they were asked to see had changed during this time. There was an anticipation that the teams might be involved in individual cases, as they normally are, providing symptom management, but actually they found that once there was an idea of how to treat COVID-19 symptoms, that the complex symptom management that palliative care has wasn't necessarily needed. And instead, other parts of the healthcare system were calling on the palliative care teams for support and education about end-of-life care. So there was that collapsing of what palliative care could do just to be about end of life. So for example, one of the teams found themselves, as one interviewee told us, they were attending meetings in other wards, debriefing rounds if there was somewhere in the hospital where there were a lot of deaths that staff weren't used to experiencing, providing staff support, rather than necessarily seeing if they had any patients that needed PAL care. So the focus for the teams was much more on other staff than patients per se at certain times of the pandemic. And because of this, the teams reported that they were developing new working relationships with other professionals or intensifying existing ones. For example, they worked much more closely with other hospital wards, particularly the ICU, and in the community, they were working way more closely with nursing homes, GPs, and district nurses, to the extent that they were coordinating their visits and actually switching tasks of who could do what things in a patient's home. They were blurring these professional boundaries then, and actually that blurring reflects a very long-held belief within palliative care as a specialty that actually end-of-life care should be everyone's business and not just something that palliative care does. And this distribution of end-of-life care was really heightened during the peak of the pandemic in the spring in London, when there was that increase of death rates and a much more distribution of death within the healthcare system. Nevertheless, during this time, there was some concern that these shifts might be negatively impacting the non-COVID patients that are usually within their patient caseload, and that they were being sidelined both by palliative care and other aspects of the healthcare system. There were also concerns that although they were developing these intensified relationships with other professionals, that those professionals might only think about palliative care in the acute dying phase for people, rather than the usefulness of palliative care over a longer period of time in patient care. In that, they started to become concerned that palliative and end-of-life care that was being delivered might not meet their usual standards, especially as it became removed from the bedside and more remote or mediated between technologies or other professionals. That had implications for how the professionals viewed their own work, but also about how they thought about how they might engage with people and the intimacy and care that might be involved, which now Annelieke will talk about further.
Yeah, thank you, Erica. So the notion of care is often linked to ideas of touch and physical proximity, highlighting the extent to which it is conveyed through closeness and ongoing interaction. Palliative care staff view one of their functions as one of their core functions as being with and being alongside a patient during their illness and end of life, rather than simply being part of a clinical team that intervenes on the body. And typically those providing palliative care regularly, so these are the specialist teams, establish relationships with patients and their family members through repeated visits, mainly face-to-face, over an extended period of time if possible, and often right up until the patient's death. Indeed, the palliative care team prefer it if they can be involved in a patient's trajectory early on, in order to have more time to establish those relationships that allow them to speak openly about death and dying. For dealing explicitly with mortality and the many physical and emotional burdens that accompany it shapes how staff form relationships with patients and their family members, based on a shared and quiet recognition of the situation and a genuine sense of closeness. The relationships, however, do not include crude expressions of sympathy or pity. Palliative care practitioners work to build relationships in which compassion is accompanied by a level of practical and realistic truthfulness. This version of intimacy is consequently foregrounds a degree of frankness regarding end of life and death by avoiding euphemisms and false hopes. As one of the palliative care nurses said to us, they provide a gentle honesty. But of course, did I go? Sorry. Yeah, but of course, these ways of working were greatly restricted during the impact. This is your slide, Erica. There we go. So these were greatly disrupted by the impact of COVID-19 and interventions to control its spread. Not only, as Erica just mentioned, did the workload grow exponentially as the rates of people dying increased, but the strict restrictions on face-to-face encountered and often the curtailed timescale between the actual first point of contact and death meant that staff could not adopt their usual strategies to provide support. And in addition, as Erica also mentioned, they often had to give up their own relationships with patients temporarily in order to teach and support others to integrate intimacy within their encounters with patients and families. And because COVID patients were often so ill that they were not able to talk or they were unconscious and relatives were not allowed inside the hospital, staff had very little opportunity to gain any sense of the patient as a person or what their wishes might be, because they sometimes or often do this through looking at how family members engage with patients rather than direct conversation with them about the patient. So the requirement to wear personal protective equipment, PPE, posed an additional barrier to establishing any sense of intimacy, not only for staff, but also for relatives. Because it wasn't just that gloves and gowns and masks were uncomfortable and cumbersome, but they introduced this sense of barrier. So they, in that workshop that we did with the palliative care team, they flagged up to us that there so much happens non-verbally, and it is just very hard to establish rapport if a patient can only see your eyes. So then referring to having to wear the mask. So the importance of the modest act of intimacy, such as touching somebody's arm, now became very obvious in their absence. One of the nurses came back to the palliative care office once from seeing an elderly lady who wasn't actually dying from COVID, but that meant that the staff members still wore masks, the general surgical masks and gloves that they wear now with patient contact. And she told the team that the patient had asked her, would you mind if I just touch the skin of your arm, because I haven't touched an actual other person's skin at all for weeks. And, you know, you could wash your arm afterwards. And that nurse then said, you know, she did that because she felt that things like that mattered. And indeed, she could wash her arm. So, but it just made really obvious that these acts of intimacy were absent in that time. When patients were close to death and few family members were allowed into the hospital for one last time, even they were required to wear full PPE. And one consultant described to us how what she called regulating intimacy became one of her key tasks, not in the sense that having to curtail it, but desperately trying to find ways to actually establish it. So she described how relatives stood at the end of the bed and needed more encouragement than usual, saying, obviously it's through 2 layers of gloves, but you can hold your relative's hand. And sometimes people don't know whether they can approach somebody who's dying. But now, even more than before, I needed to explicitly give permission that they could have some contact and they could sit as close to the bed as they wanted to in those kinds of things. So while it may be assumed that proximity is the only way to establish intimacy, and therefore that the adoption of presumably detached technological mediators obstruct and prevent an ability to care. But staff worked really hard to establish new ways of creating this intimacy, despite the need to maintain distance. So in many instances, digital technology provided a novel means to establish and maintain relationships. Although palliative care staff working in the community were already used to having telephone check-ins with patients, this now quickly became the new norm with most patients and their family members, while only going into patients' homes when it was absolutely necessary. And they observed that many of the organizational hesitations and technical obstacles that they had experienced in doing this kind of work earlier were now suddenly deprioritized, as the urgency to address COVID provided a new rationale to shift and switch decisions and changes to the services. And the result was that they then, going into the homes much less, they felt that they established much more of a bond with family members here too, for they then served as their eyes and ears in the home, noticing how the patient was and describing what kind of changes were occurring. So in the hospital, by contrast, family members were notably absent. So as one consultant acknowledged when looking back at the initial week, she said, I don't think anybody thought this, but basically this initial period was like, I haven't spoken to any relatives because there isn't anybody here. But then because they realized that you know, after they recovered from their own sense of panic of what was happening, they realized that obviously they weren't there because they weren't allowed, and they then took to calling families regularly, aware that the uncertainties about the disease were often exacerbated by the inability of patients, family, and staff to meet face to face. And again, an intensive care consultant described the staff's realization of the importance of this contact with relatives as one of the few gains of the pandemic. So he described that this is actually something that he felt they might want to hang on to because it's just gotten so much better in this time. And he explained that the increased communication with family members instilled a strong sense of trust in the medics, but reciprocally the staff being more open to families about what care could be offered and what the limitations of that care were. When loved ones could not be present in hospital, patients could sometimes speak to them via video conferencing as well. And while this enabled contact, it also came at a cost. So here a doctor told us that there had to be somebody who held the device, which then made it possible for the patient to speak to the family members, but at the same time meant that these staff members willingly and unwillingly became part of these emotionally very challenging, difficult moments, and sometimes a number of times per week. So that was just a type of intimacy perhaps that they hadn't anticipated and weren't ready to deal with. So just to sum up, the use of established and new technology demonstrated how intimacy could sometimes be established despite distance. And perhaps without intending to, the limitations of this were compensated for by making more frequent contact and being open about the uncertainties that accompanied the extraordinary nature of the situation. And at this point, it's just important to emphasize that this technology did have limits, and the professionals very much also saw that for themselves. And that we explain that through, you know, that it clashes with expectations about what death and dying should look like, something that the next speaker will undoubtedly speak to. So relationships were always constrained and mediated by the sense that presence through technology was always only a substitute for face-to-face presence. And at this point, I'll pass back to Simon.
So just to return to some general themes that we're trying to tie together. We very briefly just touched on examples of intimacy and relating that were reported to us by people we work with. But these were all clearly accompanied by experiences of vulnerability and exposure. And the point is that this is in direct contrast to the population logic of all the public health policies and government messages that emphasize distance, protection, and confinement. So in contrast to a detached vantage point and a strategy based on separating individuals, shifting perspective to accounts of people caring for others who are dying serves to highlight their continued efforts to connect and communicate, whether that's to touch, to empathize, to attach, or to share. And these facets we're trying to suggest form a different kind of the collective that's based not only on ways of relating, but in the process, shape and mold the people themselves as they're affected by their own practices. So in addition to the specific insights that we have about the ways professional carers coped, emerged with the emerging situation and learnt from it, our argument has been that because the official representation drawn from epidemiology was so based on a notion of population, not only emphasized overall infection rates and mortality totals that could be attributed to COVID-19 or not, but it also constructed a particular version of the collective that was under threat, and therefore only particular ways of how it should be responded to. By describing the ways in which the lives and deaths of people are intrinsically relational, studies like ours, anthropology, not only can make these things visible, but present them as foundational, offering a different idea of the social that potentially provides an alternative way to think about the pandemic and what it might mean to care for those who are suffering from the condition. In this way, the pandemic foregrounded what has always been the case, but that so often gets ignored because it appears to be paradoxical. And that is that we're persons because we're social, and that we're only able to be individuals, whether that's during our life or when we're dying, because we always rely on other people. Thank you from all of us.
Well, thank you very much for a very, very moving presentation, which takes us obviously right to the heart of this terrible crisis. We've already got some questions flooding in, but could I just ask for just 2 points of clarification, please? I understand that this was a rework of an existing ESRC project. I'm sure many people around the world will be fascinated to know how you were able to reconfigure an existing project and apply it in these novel settings. I'm sure that's widely relevant to all of us as professionals. And could I ask you a little more about the methodology that you used to collect your material? Because clearly there would have been immense practical difficulties that obviously you managed to overcome. So that's to begin with, please.
I'll have a quick stab at it and then probably leave the details if there are any to Erica and Annelieke. I mean, the truth is, I don't think we want to present this as a standalone research project, right? This is very much a response to being towards the end of our fieldwork, having formed very genuine and long-standing relationships with a whole range of healthcare professionals, whether they're both in palliative care, intensive care units, and elsewhere. And all of a sudden, the pandemic appeared. We already had these relationships. And so we did the best we could, notwithstanding the obvious restrictions of social distance and the fact that actually people weren't allowed in hospitals at the time. So we're talking the standard kind of techniques that almost have become germane to this now, using things like Zoom, phone calls, emails, all sorts of things. There were one or two face-to-face encounters, but on the whole, not. I don't know if Annelieke or Erica want to come in on that.
Yeah, I think that's well put. We just continued those conversations. We had a workshop scheduled anyway, which we, even throughout the project, always in part aligned to what were our thoughts, but also always already what the team felt they wanted us to address. So in this case, it was just very obvious that it had to be about COVID, where there's so many questions on all sides, so that we together really engaged with those questions. I think it was just almost automatically that we ended up in this position.
I will add one thing. I guess one of the differences is when we were doing the study pre-COVID and we were doing our ethnographic fieldwork, is we could see how they were engaging with patients and families because we could shadow them. But the way we had to adapt the methods now meant that we didn't have that same access. So there is a gap in our current data around sort of that patient perspective or that interactional perspective, because it's all mainly based on reported accounts rather than us observing it in that respect. So there's a difference in that. And, you know, should things continue like this for a while, we'd have to think about how methods could further adapt to enable more of that kind of data.
Yes, yes, I see. And there are obvious implications, of course, for recording and making it available subsequently. And that kind of brings me into the question from the floor here. So Tom Marshall asked a question and said, how did you find the experience of gaining approval for your study, given that it was qualitative and encompassed vulnerable individuals and groups on a potentially sensitive topic? He says, thank you.
So I don't know if where the question is coming from. In a sense, part of the answer is to say, well, this is was a continuation of the approvals that we had to gain initially. So obviously doing any kind of research on end-of-life care, people who are dying and their relatives, and the potential distress that conducting research might give them, and also the concerns with the professionals themselves who, as we've sort of emphasized today, see part of their job is to be vulnerable, right? And in a sense, not to exploit that vulnerability by simply researching them, meant that we had to go through all the different kind of hurdles and machinations, not only of institutional ethical approval, but there's quite a rigorous NHS ethical process that's, to be honest, designed for large RCTs rather than small, modest ethnographic studies. And then we had to go through a further kind of approval because we would be having access to patient details without those patients actually gaining consent. And I think the thrust of our argument was that the research is important, that we will be vigilant, and that we will be open with the process as much as possible. And that certainly paved the way for conducting our original research and carried through really to this, where, as Erica said, we concentrated on the professionals, where, to be honest, there are different ethical considerations that come in. So patients and professionals in the UK are treated as very different categories in lots of these debates.
Just perhaps to add to that, I think it was interesting to see that during the field work, there were also lots of ethical considerations, obviously, but then I felt very much that the people we've been working with, they're in those situations as well. So I think that there was an additional shielding. So in selecting the patients we spoke to, for instance, they said, you know, if the social worker was involved, and intensely the social worker, those were not the patients they would send me to. So they would find patients who were maybe a bit more open about, you know, coming to the end of their life. So in that sense, yeah, there's definitely some sort of selection that the professionals also did for us. And I felt always that was doing their ethics, and that was part of the fieldwork in that sense, that they themselves also thought about their patients and what would be good for them.
Yes, I see. Would you like to add anything further?
Other than, I think also within at least the UK setting is the ethics boards, like also seeing if you have a track record of doing research in this area, which we do have, because that helps reassure them that you know the correct protocols and procedures to follow. And we as a team always indicate to them that as anthropologists, we look at ongoing consent as well, and that it's not just a one-off, someone signs a form and that's what we take, but that we're constantly attending to people's capacity and consent and involvement in the study.
Oh yeah, that's really interesting. I also imagine the London School has a very, very long track record of building really good professional capacity in these considerations. But yes, thank you. And Lali Yalchin, hello Lali, how are you? Lali Yalchin asks, what about the multicultural background in essence? So the caregivers from different migration backgrounds, did some of them have greater skills than others in changing and adapting?
I think that's a great question. The three of us talked this morning about the fact that we've not had room really to think about or address that in this short presentation. I'm not sure we have enough data to think about that. I think Eric and Annelieke might want to come in on the fact that I don't know why, but it seems like palliative care does seem to be predominantly a white specialism within the hospital. That's not to say that other carers of different kinds aren't involved. Of course they are. But in terms of the specialty, the clinical specialty, both in the hospital and in fact in the community, they tend to be white British, which provides a particular kind of line to it. But they themselves are highly sensitized. So certainly before in the UK, it was very late really when it hit the headlines about the disproportionate effects that the pandemic was having on BAME communities. The professionals that we spoke to, the people we spoke to, the friends basically that we had, were highly aware and sensitized to this from the outset, really. Not based on epidemiological evidence or demographic knowledge, just their day-to-day experience of what was occurring.
Would either of you like to comment on that as well?
The only thing I'd comment additional to what Simon said is it being a predominantly white British profession, particularly within the teams who were studying, even though they were in London, it's also quite female dominated as well. And that plays into their sensitivities around being very vulnerable and emotional and reflexive. They see those as key skills that they have.
Well, it's certainly, well, thank you for that response. It's certainly a very surprising one that we'll all have to think about quite a lot, actually. But thank you. Well, moving on to the next question. Christina Douglas talks about the situation in America. And I'll summarize her question a little bit. But she says that in US care homes, all external visitors have been cancelled, or external visits have been cancelled to protect the residents. However, some were allowed when a resident was on an end of life, which meant that some family members found this as a solution so that they could visit their relatives, and particularly those with dementia, whose decline got even worse due to further isolation. And she asked whether this switch perhaps could affect your research by implicating people who might not necessarily be at the end of their life. And does this potentially change what we understand by care and end of life?
Sorry, can you repeat that? So would that implicate the switch in our?
Yes, I think what I think Christina is asking here is whether, in order to get permission to visit by relatives, one in effect has to change the status of the patient to move them from being long-term unwell and needing care to put them in a palliative context, and then the possibility of visiting them suddenly opens up. And so did you see that kind of switch, almost switching or gaming the system, you could say, obviously in a very serious context? Did you see that happening at all?
It's a lovely question. Thank you. I think we would have very much liked to include care homes, but as they weren't initially in the Forms of Care project, and we didn't have enough time yet to expand this into that field, we haven't actually looked at care homes. But it's definitely a personal interest of mine, you know, all the things that happened there. And even one of the interesting things I heard is you know, the how when family members were no longer allowed in care homes, and they then were closed down effectively to people outside the care home. But then the care home residents still fell ill, and it was, you know, then a lot of questions were, you know, how do caregivers relate to that idea of then being blamed in a way for the infection? And I don't know, there's all these interesting questions, and really also emotionally and difficult questions that still need attention. So yeah, I don't think we can answer this question directly unless Erica and Simon have an idea, but definitely something would be worthy of exploring further.
I'll just quickly follow up. In that it might be very much a British story, but and it's something that currently is being reflected upon by government and policymakers. But here there's a very clear and categorical distinction between healthcare and social care. And this is not an original comment to make, but it's very clear that the original arguments and discussions were around the National Health Service and how it might and was going to cope with COVID-19 and patients who will be end of life. And, you know, social care, as in, you know, the residential care homes and so forth, was very much an afterthought, if a thought at all. And we certainly have heard from some of the clinicians and other people we work with about how, because they were so focused on their own jurisdictions of working within a hospital or working within the NHS, they really did, to some extent, you know, not focus on the long-term effects of sometimes sending patients out to care homes. And rather than just see that as a kind of a geographical shift, it was a shift in terms of notions of responsibility, the kind of language that was used, the kind of focus about where the threat lay. And I think there is quite a lot of ruminations that are going on at the moment about when the second spike happens, if it's going to happen, how to ensure that that doesn't happen. they've been talking about integrating social and healthcare for decades in this country, but it's an intransigent problem, it seems.
And just to add to that, that was very much about attention, but also material stuff, right? That the PPE was very much only, became obvious that obviously in care homes that was also needed. So yeah, it's very real consequences of that.
Thank you. We've got time just for a quick point before we have to move on to the next speaker. But there's a question on the resilience of the carers with whom you were working. I mean, did they have to develop extra techniques of resilience to cope with this crisis, or were they drawing on existing support that they themselves had developed before the crisis began?
So I'd say that these teams are generally quite reflexive as a team, but also as individuals, and sort of as a generally practice different ways of enabling and building their resilience, and are quite aware of how their normal work in palliative and end-of-life care can strain them. But Annelieke might want to say more on this in terms of resilience, but when we had our workshop last month, there was definitely some comments where they were like, it's now hitting us in June, exactly how hard these past few months were. So even though it's a team that's primed to deal with these types of scenarios quite regularly, it was still something that was quite difficult. And because of the added strains of having to worry about family members, being a vector of disease between patients and all of that, there were added levels to their normal day-to-day work that they were experiencing that definitely had a toll with time.
Yeah, I very much agree. And I think there was a mixture of things. They were of old strategies, if you will, that they knew how to support each other, but also of the community team. For instance, I know that they created a room in which they weren't allowed to talk about COVID, so that there was actually a space where people could go to get some respite from constantly being bombarded with messages and stories and demands. And I think things like that were very much new and creative. And from all of these small ways of dealing with it, I think they also lost each other's physical sort of, they weren't in the same office, so they couldn't debrief afterwards in the pub or anything that, teams might do. So it must have been really hard, and from what they've told us, but also did they emerge with the feeling of, we've really pulled through in a way. And I think while they were saying that, at the same time, they were acknowledging that in itself was almost a second job. So it cost them a lot of energy to do that. So, while they said we'd love to hang on to that feeling of great achievement and that we did it as a team, they were also just aware of that in the long term, that will come at a toll.
Thank you. Just a very quick sentence to end it, David. Just to say that one of the interesting things that definitely occurred was, although they had these kind of already these skills and the sense of the team and mutual support internally to deal with patients and relatives, the one area where the resilience debate did switch was that they felt quite vulnerable to more external factors. They felt very much left on their own. The uncertainty and non-standardization that Erica mentioned in the talk really meant that many of them felt cut adrift and sense unsupported. So suddenly requiring resilience in places that they didn't even know that they needed it.
You mean vis-a-vis their family?
No, vis-a-vis the system, vis-a-vis the NHS, vis-a-vis the policy language that was being flooded every day. Everything seemed completely alien to the work that they were having to do daily in and out.
And that was even at higher manager level as well.
Yeah, and maybe one last thing to say is what I found really interesting, that this threat of the second spike was always there, and wasn't quite sure when it would hit or when the first would even end. And while they were dealing with, so as Erica said, while they were dealing with the first spike, they were very much worried about what happened to their regular patient caseload, and they always knew that's gonna hit us in a way. Once this all is over, there's another load that is just going to come our way, and we don't exactly know what that looks like. And I think that's very much this feeling of, pushing and challenging your resilience, if you want to put it in those terms, because it is very much, this, once we get over this, there'll be yet another thing, and it is very uncertain. And I think that, that just illustrated to me the constant sort of pressure that took so many different forms.
Well, thank you. This is fascinating. Let's move on to our second speaker now, and we can come back to some of these things in the general discussion. There are many, many more questions that people have asked that we haven't managed to get to, but that already we've learned a great deal. Thank you so much. So now we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Árnason from the University of Aberdeen, who will continue the same topic, speaking on good death, bad deaths, and the subject with and without care. So please, Arnar, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I start with a quick excuse, really? The campus where I work has been closed effectively for 4.5 months. So I had access to my office coincidentally very briefly this morning, but many of the references I'm going to be making, I will have to be making from memory. So if they're not as accurate as they ought to be, I hope you will forgive me. This paper really is kind of a reflection drawn from anthropology of death, to some extent on the COVID crisis, to some extent on the ordinary that these extraordinary circumstances have possibly made more visible. It's not really based on any proper particular kind of research, certainly not the kind of research that anthropologists ordinarily do. With that said, COVID-19 clearly, the epidemic clearly is a crisis. It's an economic crisis for many societies, companies, and individuals, even if not necessarily everyone. It is a social crisis. We are being told constantly that it's a mental crisis already happening and becoming a greater crisis in the near future. But it's also, I think, a crisis of death. And when I say that, I don't simply mean that it's a crisis of death because of the numbers, the so-called excess deaths that have happened as a consequence of COVID. And I don't mean either only that it's a crisis of death because of the very clearly, very unequal distribution of death that COVID brings. Surely what is striking about that is the fact that it has been regarded striking in the first place. But what I mean about COVID-19 as a crisis of death specifically is about the way in which people die of coronavirus, about the kind of death that this is. And here, I would like to draw some insight from the anthropological engagement with death more generally. Now, it's, I think, fair to say that, well, first of all, death obviously has been a topic for anthropological research, a topic of anthropological interest from the very beginning of the discipline. I think it's fair to say that recent work in the anthropology of death, much of it, by no means all of it, but much of it has focused on the sort of boundaries between life and death, between persons, between human, animal, and machine. That certain changes in advanced biomedicine have served to problematize. Issues around organ donation and harvesting would be a case in point here. But I'm going to suggest, really quite tentatively, but I'm going to suggest that COVID-19 is a crisis of death that invites a look back to the classics in the anthropology of death. And I am to a certain extent here inspired by a point made by Matthew Engelke in his recent review of the literature on anthropology of death about the ongoing importance of materiality when it comes to death, the matter of death. But if I'm here making as my starting point really the anthropological engagement with death, then I tend to go back to the work of Maurice Bloch and Jonathan Parry here. And the story that they tell of the anthropological engagement with death is that early on in the history of anthropology, there is an interest in death that focuses not least on the prevalence of fertility symbols of different kinds that become associated with death, how they become part of funeral rituals and memorialization and so on and so forth. Bloch and Parry then speak about the way in which that focus, in particular in British and French anthropology, changed when the sort of Durkheimian conception of society became the dominant theoretical orientation in anthropology. And for Durkheim, death, of course, fundamentally a crisis, or certainly a challenge, and a challenge to society. And Bloch and Parry talk about that Durkheim and his followers, they see death as a challenge to society in two distinct ways. On the one hand, death clearly ruptures the relationships between people upon which, to some extent, the solidarity of society depends. And there is, of course, a number of classic anthropological works that detail the way in which funerals or other mortuary rituals are mobilized in order to repair these relations that death has ruptured so as to ensure the proper functioning of society. But on the other hand, and possibly more fundamentally for Durkheim and Co., death is a challenge to society because even the death of one single member of society can be seen to undermine the claim to eternity upon which society's authority as a moral order in the Durkheimian sense rests. And the classic kind of study here that speaks to this, and people will be familiar with, is of course the work of Robert Hertz on double burials in I forget the name of the society now, but Borneo, if I remember correctly. That being said, Bloch and Parry propose in this kind of a context that rather than maybe assume the existence of society as a given thing, as a given order, and then kind of death as a challenge to that society, it might be more fruitful to think of death and the rituals it tends to bring into motion as an occasion for the creation of society, as this apparently external moral order. And they talk about the way in which this happens through in different kinds of ways in different sorts of societies. That most fundamentally, it happens with the elaboration, the celebration of the emphasis on fertility as part of funeral rituals. But that what stands for fertility here will vary, and it can be either the fertility of plants or animals or indeed people, depending on what is culturally understood to be the most important source of renewal culturally. Now, Bloch and Parry, they speak quite specifically about the kinds of societies that would be characterized by what Weber called traditional authority. So societies that imagine for themselves a relatively stable, if not eternal, external moral order. What I'm sort of suggesting here, or certainly what I'm thinking, and you forgive me if I'm thinking this aloud, is whether that insight from Bloch and Parry can be brought to bear on what is going on currently in contemporary Western societies in the UK and probably wider, to think about death and the rituals that tends to bring into motion as being an occasion for the creation of society in that sense, if that society, that social order is now in this particular context understood to be the individual. Important in this context and in the work that of Bloch and Parry is a distinction that they say is common, not necessarily universal, and will of course have different content in different contexts, but a distinction between a good death and a bad death. And what they draw attention to in particular is that when deaths are understood to be bad, frequently enormous work is put into trying to turn these bad deaths into good ones. And that's a notion I'm going to come back to in a moment. But I want to leave this sort of anthropology behind for a second and turn now to a body of literature that I would characterize as coming from death studies. If by that I can mean the sort of arts and humanities, largely social science, and research on death initially in Western societies, but death as a kind of a social and cultural phenomenon. And there are three general points about death in this context that comes from death studies that I want to emphasize. On the one hand is the point that in Western societies, death is fundamentally understood as a natural phenomenon. Secondly, death studies themselves really start from the lament really of the disappearance, of the death of death within contemporary Western societies. That singular figure in the history of anthropology, Jeffrey Gorer, in the mid-1950s writes about the pornography of death, meaning that death has practically disappeared from our everyday existence. It only appears to us in the kind of grotesque images that we see in the media, visualized violent deaths. And the third point about kind of death in a Western context and death studies here is there is a very persistent need in that literature, in that work, to make death more present again in people's everyday lives in a contemporary Western social context. And this has happened repeatedly over the last 50 years or so. Now, so first of all, fundamentally in Western societies, according to this literature, death is understood to be a natural phenomenon. And that means that certain deaths are violent, accidental deaths, deaths that occur as a consequence of directly attributable human agency are understood to be unnatural, and by that they are understood to be bad. They require particular kind of explanation. They require particular kind of work. And the work of Lindsay Pryor from the late 1980s, based in Belfast, is an excellent kind of a demonstration of this. But the consequence of all of that, which Pryor actually, in a way, is maybe the more key point that he makes, is that the consequence of all of this is that this kind of understanding of death in general as natural, with violent accidental deaths that can be attributed to a particular human agency, that serves to naturalize deaths that happen as a consequence of accumulated human actions. So we have, for example, COVID here, or coronavirus, as something that remains a natural cause of death, while at the same time we are, of course, faced with the very, very unequal distribution of those deaths. But moving maybe into slightly more detail, while the literature is maybe not absolutely consistent on this, the kind of forms of death that seem to be usually regarded as good deaths in this particular ethnographic context are, on the one hand, quick, pain-free, unannounced deaths that are happening at the end of a long and hopefully full life. there are those who wish for themselves that kind of death. But then on the other hand, there is more the kind of controlled, dignified, pain-free death that happens again at the end of a long life, but at the time when the person dying has been able to put their affairs in order, as they used to say their goodbyes, and indeed they die surrounded by a family. And what is significant here is that it would appear to me that COVID-19 doesn't allow either of these good deaths really to take place. Conversations that I've been part of with doctors around here suggest that it is the dying of alone in this context that is particularly difficult. Now, can we then say that COVID deaths tend to be relatively, in this context, bad deaths? And if that is the case, might we expect to see dedicated efforts being made by society, government, individuals to turn those deaths into something better, to make bad deaths good? An example of something like that from about 20 years ago is the hugely interesting paper that Bob Simpson wrote on the case of Diane Blood, who was given permission to have children by her husband, who had by that time passed away, although he had not given permission, being in a coma when the necessary material was extracted, but allowed to do this because of a desire, Simpson says, to allow what was a singularly bad death to be turned into something good. But in the case of COVID-19, it would appear in many ways such efforts are being confounded. One way in which that people would ordinarily seek to make deaths better is through funeral practices, the mortuary rituals that they carry out. But in COVID-19, these in many ways are being quite curtailed. Funeral directors will, I've heard say that having spent significant amount of time over the last few years, couple of decades possibly, encouraging people to take charge of and personalize funerals, in many ways they now had to say to those same people, actually, this is not possible. So what else is there? There is some signs of activism as being, if that's not too crude a way of putting it, as an outlet here. There's certainly work that exists that speaks to activism, legal, political, social movement type activism, as something that in some cases grows out of bad deaths, is a response to bad deaths. And there is some evidence of that appearing in relation to COVID. Elaborate form of online memorialization too, that would speak to this too. But there is also, and I think particularly, certainly from what I've been looking at, evident in the UK context, of the notion of death as a sacrifice coming in here. And this speaks to two of the major institutions in the UK that have been collectively mobilized as a kind of a cultural response to death. On the one hand is the NHS, which Douglas Davis has, of course, already spoken of as a kind of a sacred institution, and on the other hand is the army, or indeed, if I can call that an institution, the war, the Second World War. and sometimes the two go together. I forget now exactly when it was. It was relatively early on in all of this that the Queen addressed the nation and clearly drew links between the two, evoking the memory of evacuations during the war as a kind of as a past example of something similar to lockdown and social isolation now. The two go together in the way in which it's not restricted to COVID, the way in which illness is spoken of as a battle, as a fight that, you know, those who are maybe they're not brave enough or hardy enough lose, and indeed with the reference to frontline workers in the context of COVID, NHS, and also other workers, frontline workers. And again, there is very clearly a way in which these deaths are, some of them being construed as a sacrifice then for the greater good. This is for me interesting and significant also because in the way in which COVID has been responded to in Iceland, which would be the other case where I would be looking, there aren't these two institutions that emerge at the forefront as the kind of as the cultural resource to highlight against COVID. Rather, what is evoked there is a more kind of a general sense of national unity that is built around references to history and references against a kind of a continual struggle of a small nation against a common and external enemy that in the past was maybe natural disasters, plagues, or foreign exploitation, but is now then COVID-19. And with that, I want to go back to Maurice Bloch and Jonathan Parry. Like I said before, they propose that we can understand death, they say with reference to particular kinds of societies, as an occasion, not as Durkheim would have it, as a challenge that society somehow needs to address, but rather as the occasion to create that very society, to create the social order. And I've suggested that it might be interesting to think whether that insight from Bloch and Parry can be applied in contemporary Western contexts if then we suggest that the social order that we are speaking about is not the order of traditional authority, but rather the order that is understood to be composed of unique individuals, the unique individual as the source of and in turn itself value. Now, and I would very happily and very quickly admit that the steps here are not ones, between the two are not ones that have in any kind of a way fully been managed to trace as yet. But if there is any kind of a mileage in that link, then certainly we need to think about the context in which that social order as the unique individual is being created here, specifically in the context of COVID. And as I was thinking about that, the way in which I found it interesting to think about this is the way in which the link between the individual, the state, and the collective is being practiced and thought at a number of different levels here. And there is a link here with the previous paper and about the way in which I thought was really very, very insightful and interesting, the way in which COVID has particularly been thought about at the level of the or certainly initially at the level of the population. And I did wonder whether there is any kind of insight to be gained from thinking of Bloch and Parry and the insight that they offered here in relation to Foucault, and in particular what Foucault has to say about governmentality, and in particular about that part of governmentality that Foucault speaks about that invites us to sort of ask what is the reality that must be governed, or actually more appropriately it would be to say, how is the reality that needs to be governed imagined? And that brings me then possibly back to, I'm trying to bring that kind of, have that in conversation with Bloch and Parry. Now, the interesting thing about the NHS here in this context, and while the weekly celebrations of the NHS staff have now stopped, they will be fresh in people's memory, I would hope. And what was interesting about them was, for me, was how strikingly they really presented themselves as an example of what Lauren Berlant speaks about as politics of sentimentality. The way in which individuals are being invited to identify with some kind of collectivity, but effectively do so, but identify to some kind of a collectivity as individuals, escaping what the authors of the paper before were arguing was so hugely important to bring into the focus here, the relational. That in that kind of a way, the sort of celebration of the NHS, for example, serves as what Berlant talks about as technologies of patriotism, that are there to ensure that the collective identification remains at the level of precisely that, the collective, the population, the nation, precisely because of the way in which recent decades of political history have served to kind of effect the separation between the collective and between nation and state. And so, where I was getting to with this is about the way in which those questions of care are being thought about in this particular context. So, who it is that is to be cared for? The individual, the nation, or as was the case initially, even the herd, in order to achieve some kind of a immunity. And who is it that does the caring? Who is it that assumes the authority to decide how care should be enacted and distributed? And the way in which that takes a particular form in a kind of a context where the reality that needs to be governed is understood to be individuals, effectively individuals as members of some kind of a collectivity, population, some kind of abstract collectivity, I should say, nation, population, and so on and so forth, but in a context where precisely what the previous paper spoke about, the relational is what is elided, what is kind of made to disappear. I was so struck by the numbers that Simon spoke about, first of all, and then the pictures of the individuals who have died, because of the way in which that sort of speaks to the particular operations, the particular way in which contemporary forms of power, certainly according to Foucaultian suggestions, operates by simultaneously totalizing and individualizing. And I will stop it there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Arnar, and above all, thank you for the absolutely perfect timing. That was exactly half an hour. Really quite remarkable. It must be difficult to do in the slightly abstract atmosphere of an online talk, but well done. The points that you raise, of course, are terribly important, and they give us a chance to link these wider issues with the specific things that we have been talking about. But I did want to ask you, by bad death, it appears to me here that what you mean is a death without the collectivity, isn't it? Without the collective.
Well, I mean, I suppose what would be considered a bad death obviously would vary depending on the cultural kind of a context. When I started thinking about this and I started sort of drafting this, I mean, there's certainly kind of plenty of literature that speaks to that in contemporary Western context, broadly speaking, one form of death that people see as a good one is at the end of a long, full life, pain-free relatively, but death that comes with some kind of advance warning. You know it's going to happen. You have time to set your affairs in order. You have time to say your goodbyes, and you die surrounded by your family. As I mentioned, I spoke about some of this in a context where a doctor who works in the region here was present, and the wider kind of a way in which I thought COVID deaths were clearly a bad death in the kind of in our cultural understanding here. He didn't necessarily recognize all aspects of that, but he certainly recognized and emphasized that the kind of the way in which people were dying away from their families, not surrounded by the families, as would be more usually the case with the people that he attends to, was certainly very clearly for them and for their families more particularly a form of a bad death. Now, what I didn't go into, because to some extent that is maybe sort of speaking to a different kind of a level, is there is of course plenty of work to suggest that deaths that are understood to be bad for whatever reason, they tend to entail more complicated kind of grieving than deaths that are understood to be in that kind of a way good. So one thought here that of course I would not by any means be the first to voice is the way in which these deaths are happening now, and the kind of curtailed way in which people are able to respond to them. Of course, certain practices that are hugely important in particular contexts have simply not been allowed, let alone the kind of more kind of general restrictions on care for people dying and then recently dead. The way in which all of that will kind of fuel what people are already kind of thinking about will be really quite a significant mental health crisis as a consequence of this.
Yes, and indeed we have several questions around the idea of using virtual technology. So you don't see that virtual technology can fill any of these gaps, either temporarily or permanently?
Well, my response to that would have to be I don't know, and I've not done the kind of work that would speak to that. I know from the kind of the stories, and for the moment all I have is kind of stories rather than kind of any research that I myself have done. But what I do know is from the stories I hear, some of them, particularly back home in Iceland, it's not being seen as a substitute. Some of the kind of heartbreaking stories there are of people saying goodbyes to their mothers, their fathers, on the telephone and all of that, you know. But in a kind of a way, certainly the way the stories are presented at the moment, that that makes the heartbreak, if anything, greater rather than lesser. But as I said, I mean, that's, you know, not really anything I can speak to with anything more than something anecdotal like this.
I see. And just for clarification, in Iceland, is it the fact that people can't touch each other that makes social media such an inadequate substitution? Is it the tactile thing which is being lost?
Yes, I think so. Yes. That's certainly what you would gather certainly from the stories that I've been able to access, kind of the ones that are already available there in publicly. The sort of things that people are saying on social media themselves already. Yeah. Not being able to be there, present, hold hands, and so on and so forth. You know, care in that kind of a way.
Right. Well, yes, thank you. Well, we have a question here, moving to the role of the state. So Suvendu, and thank you for your question, asks, what is your opinion regarding the role of the state in creating political narratives of death, particularly in the case of infectious disease?
Yeah, interesting. But I mean, the could be answered in so many different kinds of ways. Obviously, the role often is huge. Obviously, often enough, something like that would be an occasion to create particular kinds of narratives that strengthen certain political powers. Often then through certain exclusionary means. I mean, I feel as if I'm stating the blindingly obvious, but you know, the characterization of the virus as having a particular kind of nationality, the way in which the presence of the virus has been used to justify further extension of certain state powers and so on is clearly both important, but maybe also well, important and worrying. A part of this I was maybe going to mention, but then, you know, keeping an eye on the clock, decided to leave out, is in the Icelandic context, COVID really has been construed as if I can put it like this, a non-political problem. So it's been very forcefully, sorry, that's not the right word, successfully, I should probably say, construed as a problem of kind of medical and police and legal order. And the people have been essentially left in charge of this are the sort of chief medical officer, a particular expert on communicable diseases. And I think he's certainly a semi-retired policeman who really made his name as sort of somebody who had particular insights into crowd control for the Icelandic Football Association. And the politicians have effectively kind of absented themselves in many ways and left it to the different kind of, you know, in the UK context, but where the government has attempted to be more present, often, of course, supported by scientists, but sought to make itself more present in the management of the disease than certainly has been the case back home in Iceland.
Yes, thank you. And there's a question from Joy Henry. Thank you, Joy, for your question. And she says, have you observed any alternative rituals surrounding death when limited numbers of people can attend a funeral? She says it seems to be common for people to come out into the street as the hearse goes by, for example. And could this be a way in which a bad death is made into a better one in these difficult times?
Yeah.
Is that possible?
Yeah. You know, very quickly I would say yes and yes. Some, well, not personally observed, but through social media and such like, precisely that. And I would tend to regard that as an attempt to do precisely this. I mean, there was one quite well-known one happened here in Aberdeen, where, I mean, the death wasn't COVID related, but happened during lockdown, and a football fan and the hearse went past the football stadium, and there was an awful lot of people out and about to kind of pay their respects and so on and so forth. And yeah, that as an attempt to turn a young person, bad death, turn a bad death into something more positive.
Yes, thank you. Well, we're at the point now when we move to all of our speakers, if they would like to come onto the screen. And perhaps a good way of starting our general discussion is to say, is there a conception of a bad death or a better death in among palliative care? Would they find that expression even meaningful in the context of their professional work?
I'll comment that. Actually, palliative care professionals often talk about good and bad deaths, or even something that's a good enough death. So they often know, generally even pre-COVID, that they can't always do everything that might be desired, and so they'll try to do as much as they can. And a lot of end-of-life care policy in the UK, which I've been studying for like the past decade, is actually focused around trying to change healthcare systems in order to enable more good deaths. And of course, what's happening now is disrupting a lot of those practices and challenging what might be usual good end-of-life care, and therefore what might normally lead to a good death, and how they usually frame it. So it's a concept they are all over.
I see. And this question of digital technology is I think obviously absolutely crucial here. And we've heard that in Iceland it's not regarded as an acceptable substitute. And there's a very nice question here from Ellen Estrada. And she says, is it possible that digital technology in reality increases the sense of loss of intimacy rather than mitigating it? So in fact, is digital technology making all this worse?
I mean, Annelieke, you do go. I mean, I was just going to say that's precisely one of the things we were trying to get at least to not go into the automatic assumption that, you know, digital technology and physical distance negates by definition forms of connection and relating. In fact, these were precisely one of the fundamental workarounds that the kind of the good death approaches Erica just mentioned were navigated. We have quite a few stories around this. I don't know, Annelieke, do you want to mention?
Please.
Which one are you hinting at, Simon?
Sorry, the iPad one, for example, or
yeah, I think I mentioned in the talk, right, where then professionals or doctors or nurses had to hold the device, and I think that was definitely one that we were very touched by. You know, that you didn't necessarily think about what that meant if a patient talked to their relative. You know, it sounded like a workaround, but also came at a cost. I think from the interviews we've had, it was very clear to all the professionals that obviously they would rather have family by the bedside, but it was, like Simon said, a workaround, and in the absence of this, this was the best possible way. And yeah, so I think it was appreciated as far as we could tell, because obviously we haven't been speaking to patients or family members, but in that sense, it was the next best thing.
Although I quickly want to add to that, at the time they made the decisions to say, you know, hold the iPads or the phones, they felt that was the best decision they were making at that time. But some of them have been reflecting as time has passed on about how that might have impacted the grief, particularly of relatives, of having to see it via those medium. And if actually it might have been harmful for some people and not for others. And that's really hard to know ahead of time. So it's not an either or straightforward, yes, this was a good, you know, workaround, but it's very much more complex, and they're re-evaluating those decisions again and again and again.
Yeah, now that you say that, it was very, you know, the palliative care team have picked up more of that bereavement work than they've usually done, because then, you know, they handed over, and now they seem a little bit more involved, as far as we could tell.
So just to clarify that point, they have a working document which outlines factors which make a death better. No, I won't say checklist, that would be ridiculous, but a series of statements that they think are contributing towards this slightly better outcome.
So I'll just say there's policy in the UK, particularly for England, around what end-of-life care should look like, and that has a very explicit definition of what a good death is, and that involves being in a familiar environment, usually surrounded by family, being symptom-free, and particularly around pain, and being aware that one's dying, for example. And then a lot of the policy outlines much more implicit versions of what a good death might be, and that's much more around the types of care that's provided. So that existed pre-COVID, that's existed since about 2008.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating, because certainly in the neighborhood where I was brought up, if a person died instantly of a heart attack, then the relatives would be deluged with congratulations and saying, you know, that is really the right way to go. I wish it could happen to me. But anyway, that's just a personal point. Now, related to that issue, Ellen has another question here, which certainly is relevant. Is what about research on the lack of chaplains or similar spiritual care during this pandemic? How does that influence our understanding of mortality? What do you think? The lack of spiritual advisors, does that mean then that the palliative care staff have to become in some way spiritual as well as medical assistants? I think that's really the point. Are they having to expand their role in ways that they wouldn't have expected to have to?
I can't say we've spoken to any chaplains. I know that in the hospital team there was one who was very closely working together with the team. I also know that palliative care specialists often bring spirituality into the set of questions that they explore. You know, what are these wishes, and is religion part of what is important to them? And so that is part of, you know, the holistic approach that Erica did mention at the beginning, that they aspire to, the holistic care that they aspire to provide. So in that sense, I don't think they've expanded, but what I have seen, what we saw during, you know, ethnography, was that whenever things became more sort of medically pressing, which they certainly were in this, that tended to move to the foreground, because that was just the first that needed sorting out, being pain-free, as Erica mentioned. And so I'm not sure what that would have looked like practically, but I can imagine there have some shifts in that regard.
So can a patient in a COVID ward who is seriously ill, can they request a priest or the equivalent still? Is that available to them?
I think they can. Yeah. Well, COVID, I don't, pre-COVID, when I did the ethnographic observations, then that was certainly the case. I can't say I can answer this question. Do you, Simon, Erica, do you know?
I haven't heard of them not being allowed to.
Yeah, I think it was just more about, it's probably more a story of resources. Certainly the height of this first spike in the London hospitals was really quite extreme for a short period of time. I mean, a lot of kind of COVID wards some of the surgical theatres were changed into ICU wards and so forth. So I just think, you know, there wasn't the support. So in that sense, there was probably a distribution, as we were talking about, of these kind of these concerns around spirituality, which certainly the palliative care team do see as a part of their role already. They don't shy away from that. And in fact, they proudly sort of robustly resist over-medicalizing their role and the job that they do.
No, we've got an answer to it in the chat box, where somebody says, my daughter is a COVID nurse and you can request faith representatives, but many were furloughed, making it challenging. Thank you, Sue.
Oh, I see. Well, yeah, that would seem to be a pity, because I would have thought that some people would regard that as being rather helpful. But there we are. Obviously, we have to go with what we've got in that situation. But Giovanni, one of our former speakers, who talks about the redevelopment of educational techniques under the impact of lockdown, she's asking, do you think that video conferencing or digital technologies, after forcibly replacing direct relationships, will leave any kind of positive legacy for the future in this triangle of patients, family, and caregiving staff?
I mean, I'll come in first. I mean, certainly we've certainly anecdotally heard very much that this change, you know, although no one exactly knows how it's going to settle down, is unlikely to be reversed entirely. Where it's been useful, in particular, has been between the different professional groups and their opportunities to talk at a distance, when in the past, you know, the logistics of getting everyone in a meeting to talk about an individual patient case was proved very, very difficult. Certainly, the people we spoke to do not dismiss and would not dismiss the role of these technologies from now on, but I think they're quite hesitant. And in the same time, of course, the kind of the managerial processes that were lagging behind, for want of a better word, are likely to catch up. So we've definitely got stories where things like Zoom and Teams were just not available and what approved before COVID. All of a sudden, the urgency allowed this kind of rough and ready approach to take place. Whether or not that will be reversed or not, we'll have to wait and see, I think.
Yes, yes. I don't know whether, Arnar, you have any comments you'd like to make about these points in relation to the theories that you're outlining?
Well, I mean, not really about that. If I'm honest with you, I haven't done that kind of research to really to be able to speak to it. I mean, like I said before, all I have are some anecdotes from Iceland where the technology did seem to be regarded not as a replacement for what ought to have been there, but I mean, that's really all I can sort of, you know, with any degree of even remote degree of authority say to this.
Can I just, I mean, really, it's a related point, but I think it's the one thing that perhaps we haven't conveyed our project is the level of sometimes some frustrations that the professionals experienced during this time as well. And that in a way, the main, you know, that key message in the UK was, you know, about saving lives, and it kind of shadowed and silenced all the other kind of issues. For example, looking after those that were dying, as though the dying were going to be the failures and the ones left behind or left to one side. And I think the professionals really did experience that. So the implementation of various policies, both within hospitals and, for example, when they were talking about, you know, the strange funeral arrangements that were kind of overwhelmingly rapidly introduced, they were felt, you know, highly cruel, not evidence-based, not really aligning with the kind of the values that they felt were the fundamental part of what their role was. So, you know, there is a sense of that. It wasn't all embracing the new. It was very much trying to resist the imposition of things that they didn't feel made sense or didn't align with their understanding of their role.
And the palliative care teams, they have, if you'll forgive the expression, agency within the hospital structure. I mean, they're not in some way outsourced and imposed upon, but their voice will be heard when these things are discussed. Does some of their frustration come from an organisational inadequacy in their relationship with the rest of the hospital?
Perhaps so. Certainly, they don't have their own patients. They are in an advisory role, so they advise teams. There was briefly an experiment where they had own patients shared with oncology, and that was only temporary. So there might be changes in the future still, but yeah, that was definitely a frustration, more so with some disciplines than with others. So previously we've had you know, some conversations about how it was harder, say, with ICU or hematology. Hematology was often mentioned as a discipline that has a lot of treatment options to their available to them, and therefore it is perhaps harder to say we have tried everything, and you know, we'll start conversations about what other choices we might make, and therefore that was often hard for palliative care to come in early, because that wasn't seen for doctors as even a possibility, not out of an uncaring kind of attitude, but precisely out of this trying to do the best. And then, yeah, so in those kind of situations, there was often a frustration.
Okay. Can I ask? I mean, palliative care. At the same time, would it be right to say? I mean, there's a certain degree of resistance there to precisely that, because I mean, it's certainly in some contexts, the literature says that what palliative care is very much trying to get away from is any kind of sense of medicalization. That they want to kind of present themselves as that which is not the kind of, strictly speaking, medical. Would that be a part of this sort of scenario?
And you mean the medicalization as in the treatment, or what?
Yeah, yes. So, I mean, obviously, as you know, that kind of the hospice movement and palliative care arises out of, to some extent, out of a kind of a resistance to the medicalization of death, and that kind of ideal remains to some extent part of it, that people within palliative care speak sometimes, at least, about the kind of danger of palliative care becoming medicalized like the rest of medicine.
Yeah, so certainly I think our project took as a starting point to see, what kind of alternative understandings and actions and non-actions could be thought of in a situation for a patient, and to certainly see as an alternative to cure, to think about other options early on, perhaps. To have that as one of the options on the table. So that's really where our project started. Yeah, so I would agree to that.
And can I just say, I mean, just to reiterate really, Annelieke, I think they do to some extent see themselves as kind of resisting medicalization, but it's not medicalization in a crude sense, right? They're incredibly technical experts in things like pain management, and they know more about drugs than many of the other specialists, and then kind of they raise their eyebrows at the kind of the mismanagement, the technical mismanagement of patients. So their anti-medicalization is much more around trying to resist this imperative to constantly treat and cure. It's about trying as best they can to find the spaces and the kind of language that allows care to include acknowledgement that the patient is actually dying, and that shouldn't be framed always as failure.
And in that sense, it is, I think, a move away from the crude medicalization, that in the sense that it diversifies the values that they're striving for. So it isn't so much cure and long life, but it is really what kind of life, and therefore the conversation with the patient are so much moved to the foreground, because that is different per patient. And although there are obviously kinds of patient that they then construct, I think it is to them very much also keeping their own judgment to themselves as much as possible, and to start a conversation without knowing what might be the most important thing for this particular patient. So in that sense, yeah.
Yes, well, we're kind of approaching the end, but Robert McDowell would like to ask, and thank you for your question, Robert. How does the possibility of a second wave of the virus affect all this? I mean, is this something that the palliative people are conscious of, that doctors and ICEs, how are they preparing, and how does that affect what's going on?
I'll start if that's okay, and I won't take long. I didn't say as much about Iceland as I was going to initially when I proposed the paper, just because things were dealt with there quite swiftly, and it seemed to be going away. But actually, just in the last few days now, there is very clear evidence of, if you want, a second wave appearing there. So restrictions on movement and such like are being imposed, literally as I speak, just now. There was an extensive, no, that would not actually be accurate. There was some, maybe not as extensive as it should be, discussion about kind of opening up as happened, with the kind of danger of there being a second wave. But there were doctors who advised that it shouldn't be done so quickly, and so there is that.
Thank you. And what about the palliative care people? Do they talk about the future as well as the difficulty of their present situation?
Yeah, so I would say they do. And I mean, when we were holding our workshops with them last month, they were definitely thinking about what might the next few months do? How do we manage the resources we have, both as a team and also individually? And also reflecting on that vulnerability we spoke about, both in terms of that decision making, but also, you know, their own physical vulnerability. Like, how might they prepare for that in the future? You know, what mechanisms do they need in terms of collective decision making in order to enable them to feel like they're more on a stable and safe ground, for example. So they are thinking ahead, and they are definitely thinking also how it might impact their workload along their other patients. Again, like as Annelieke said, there's that concern about the non-COVID patients and how they are being adequately cared for during this time, how they're going to balance those different kinds of work.
But is there
In
any
many
sense?
ways, sorry.
Please. No, go ahead, please.
No, I think in many ways they're also flagging up though how the second wave will be very different from the first, and precisely what Erica said, the high sense of uncertainty around what it is, what it was going to look like. I think much of that, having done that once now, that will feel very different a second time around. Not to say it is not going to be, they're not talking about it and thinking about it, they're very much thinking about it and planning for it, but there are certain elements that are very significantly different because they've done it before.
Yeah. Well, we're just about out of time. So I would like to thank you all for a fascinating, albeit somewhat somber afternoon, but where we also all learned a great deal. Thank you. And I would like to thank the speakers from all of the seminars that we've had. It's been a remarkably coherent seminar series, right from the beginning, when we were talking about the state-imposed lockdowns and the miniaturization of lockdown in various different places around the world. To domestic scenarios of education and balcony ritual, now through to the absolute heart of the matter, the end of people's lives in hospital. So it's been a wonderful journey, and I would just like to invite Hygiene and Emma forward, please, if they would like to come and take a round of applause, because you have been absolutely marvelous in your technical abilities. I can't think of a professional radio station that would have done better than you have. So thank you very much indeed. And thank you to all our speakers. And please do feel free to join the RAI community. We would welcome you. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.